essentially to that growth in terms of additional beds that this administration has put in is really what makes sense on that. So we started with 253 funded beds, and now we have 460 operational with funding for 553, and another by the end of 2019, 753. Those aren't massive numbers when you talk about like New York City standards, but when you're talking about young people under the age of 21, that is a pretty significant number. There are significantly more homeless young people in the 21 and over categories as they are in that younger category, which is DYCD's domain right now. So I feel really excited because we're seeing that on any given night we have, like, on average almost a couple of dozen empty and available beds. And so we're able to say to providers or people from Department of Education or caring people in the field or council people, you know a young person under 21, like, give us a call because there's a really good chance we have a bed available right now to take that young person in. So that's very different than the experience several years ago where the demand was significantly greater than the supply. So the expansion of beds is number one, and number two is the collaboration. I feel this is like markedly different in this administration than we've experienced, and in terms, not just in terms of like be collaborative and work together, but in terms of concrete commitments. And the ones that we're working on right now are working with Department of Homeless Services to say, if you have a young person there who's under 21, do they know that we have small, supported, home-like environments with a lot of support services and counseling and life skills support? Because they should know that that's an option. Not that they need to leave, but that we're here for them. We are working on being able to make direct referrals from, when you turn 21, you're not eligible for runaway and homeless youth services in New York State right now. But we don't necessarily want you to have to go to the intake center and the adult shelter system. We know a lot of young people are not interested in that experience. So we are looking at a way where if a counselor at a DYCD funded shelter has enough experience with you, they can get you to bypass intake in the DHS system. And then thirdly, working together to access to be able to access the same services that you would get if you were in the adult system from the youth system. So access to rental subsidies, streamlined access to supportive housing, and it's really been a great time of change for us.
Can I ask, I know there's been some advocacy around raising the age limit for youth beds from 21 to 24. I believe there was a change in state law. Any thoughts on that? Whether that's...
Yeah, I mean, we're like youth development people at DYCD, so we definitely appreciate a youth environment for young people. We're still under 21 right now. That would take effect. A county has an option to opt into the 21 and over, and that would take effect in January. I think if the city determines in the best interest and with available resources that we're going to have DYCD address that group, that it would be separate and additional resources. Because I feel as I mentioned, we're so close to being able to say there should be no young person under 21 on the streets. We have enough resources for them, and so what we've always been very protective of is that doesn't come at the expense of the younger ones, more vulnerable ones, but that it's additional. And so that'll be a conversation at the city with about the availability of additional resources. But certainly we recognize young people do better in a youth environment. And I do want to take one more second to say that there's a lot of advocacy around DYCD services because, hey, we are the experts in youth development, and there hasn't been a tremendous amount of advocacy on making youth better served in the adult system. And I think your work to develop that shelter in the Bronx has been also, like, to not understating it, profound, because it's the first time young adults, older young adults, but still young adults, were given an opportunity in the adult system since, they have a couple of young adult shelters that have been around forever, but this is the first new opportunity. And our providers, who are very particular about their young people getting a youth-specific environment, are raving about the experience at the Project Renewal site. So I'm so grateful for that, because we can't do it alone. that's all of the agencies working together to address. Thank you.
Hi.
And your PowerPoint is ready if you want to use it.
Oh, okay.
It's right here on the podium.
Yeah,
That was a well-timed.
yeah, well timed. Sure, I'll use it, and I'll just let you know, CIDI is a center of integration, as mentioned by the council member. So we try to integrate all the data, and we try to help people to think about an issue through an integrative process. And that's some of the problems with our youth, in the sense that just from the world of growing up, when you're a youth, you're involved in education systems, you're involved in youth care systems, and it's hard to sometimes have these systems come together and support youth in a way that would be helpful for them. And that our job from CIDI is really to help people to see that we live in a silo sometimes as we define a problem. And we all have our way of looking at a problem, and we have different languages and different educational experiences and professions of how we see a problem. So we try to, if you will, we take the old social work atom, begin where the client is. And so we begin where the data is. And we try to make sense of the data and use the data as a way to have a deeper understanding to the people that we're serving. And understanding with that the limitations of that process, and to bring in more the lived experience of people and people who are trying to help people, so that we can come up with better ways to do some advocacy and to help us to get out of our silos so we can better help people. And that's what CIDI is basically about. We also are an analytical shop, so we try to bring the best of math and science and match it with social work ideas, so that we have these three professions coming together to come forth with some thinking that maybe while you're doing the work, you kind of know in your gut, but nobody's put it out on paper for you. So that's what our role is, and that's what we try to do. In the last couple of years, we have, as Susan has mentioned, at ACS, we have really worked closely together we applied for an application for youth through the HUD Continuum of Care NOFA. And in that process, we started to learn a lot about what is going on with youth homelessness. There was a focus on veterans homeless, and we now wanted to shift as well, learn what we did in veteran homeless, and think through some of those ingredients. Can we work with youth homeless and have the same positive response? And so we came together as a group, and our center, if you will, try to bring all sorts of folks together, the youth themselves, the providers, researchers, advocates, to have a lively discussion as to what are some of the next steps. So we began with the data, and without undue, I often forget to mention Eileen Johns and Jessica Rathel are really the people at CIDI who do this work, and who are authors of this report that I'm sharing with you, which is looking at, and you can get this report online at nyc.gov/CIDI. And we have a variety of reports there, but this is the transitioning of youth. And we were interested in looking at the different agencies and youth who exit and what happens. And that's what the report is about. So we looked at ACS, of the youth who leave. We looked at DHS, of the young people who leave there. It was from 18 to 24. And we looked at DYCD as well. And we looked at the outcomes and to see who comes back and who doesn't come back, and if there's something we can do. And I'll go through a little bit of that. But why you're looking at this ladder in this ziggly situation here on the slide, is that I think, at least generationally in our generation, there was this ladder to success. And it's still in the world where we think of you study hard, you do the right thing, and you move up the ladder. And we have now know that ladder is really not a ladder. What it is more like a jungle gym. That's what I was trying to get to. And in that jungle gym, and it's probably all of our lived experiences, you have, even in your work life, if you think about it, it's not unusual that you've had what you consider a very good job, and then you go to not such a good job. Or you have not such a good job, and you go to a very good job. And life is very fluid these days in terms of our work. And that's how it is with our youth. And youth is supposed to be that way. And the way youth experiences are not what adult experiences are. If youth get fired a couple of times, actually that outcome isn't as bad as an adult getting fired. Youth are supposed to be making mistakes. If they get fired a couple of times, they're living and learning. And that's actually a positive thing. And in our youth development models, and you're living and learning how to talk to your boss, how to, not overshare, and not keep saying, yo, give me this, yo, give me that. But this is the learning process that youth go through. And it's more to the right, if you will, of a jungle gym. And that's appropriate for the age. And I want to also say, before I'll get into a little bit of the report, but I'm going to skip to what spectrum of housing resources that we have for youth. And you can see we do a lot of work in our city. We have prevention and engagement. We have mental health, education, substance abuse, physical health. We have our parks department. We have our crisis intervention of outreach teams, drop-in centers. These are specific programs for homeless youth. And much of these programs are transitional independent living facilities, DYCD beds, and you can see ACS housing subsidies, the NYCHA, the linked housing, the New York 4 beds, all of the kinds of resources that are going into helping us work for making life a little easier and supportive for youth who are homeless. And this is something that the city has made a commitment. And I just want to go back to my first slide, is that this is what we see in our agencies, is how many, where people are. Like we see in foster care in 2015, we just used some data that, this is a little less today, but it's around 1,200 youth are aging out discharged from foster care. You have in DYCD about 13,000 kids using a drop-in shelter, 2,500 kids using the crisis shelter, 519 kids using the TILs. As Susan just mentioned, that's going to be expanded because of the increase of what the mayor has committed to. In DHS, single adult shelters, we have 3,200 youth. Safe havens, we have 18 youth, 19 youth. In our outreach, we have 54 youth. This is the outreach just at DHS. And then when you look at DHS with youth, and we think of youth that we don't think of often, that's where we have families with children. And we have about 6,000 families with children who are under the age of 24 who are at DHS. And we don't tend to think of homeless families as youth, and because they're homeless families, but they're families headed by youth who are women with often partners who are young people. And so we try to put it all together and say, this is the group that we're working with, and they're all over our agencies. And in our response is typically because of our agencies have regulations, they have missions, they respond in a way that that agency has been developed. And they're not necessarily responding to the youth who are in those agencies. So that has been a lot of the tensions, if you will. It's not because people don't have the goodwill and the desire and want to work together collaboratively. It's that the way our laws are written, the way our funding is brought down to us. We have services designed for young children when we're talking about somebody who's 17. And we have services designed for adult homeless people when they're young moms with children. So these are the kinds of ways that we try to think through. How can we have a model that we can have some essential ingredients wherever you walk in the door as a youth, that you're treated like a youth, and that those ingredients are embraced in your agencies. So that's the work that we've been trying to do as a city, to come up with models of an assessment system so that no matter where youth walk in the door, we have an assessment that's based on their needs and their capacities. It's their needs and their capacities, matching them with services is really what we all are looking to do in what we call the CAPS world that you might have heard about through the continuum of care. And that's some of the work that we're looking at. In addition, we're looking at housing models. Not all youth need to have their own apartment. Most youth at this point in time, youth can't afford it. A lot of people can't afford their own apartment. Never mind youth. You know, kids who are coming back from Ivy League colleges are not coming back to their own apartment. They're coming back to their parents' home. And most youth are having to share with other youth and to figure out how to survive in this environment, in this housing market. And so our models are really have been tied to one person, one apartment. And we've been trying to think through, how do we do that? We see that at ACS, they've done some work around looking at that differently, where homeless services is tied into a legislative mandate where they can't do that right now, where DYCD has always had a youth development model. So we're looking to get the best from these agencies and come up with ingredients that would shore up all of our services and support for homeless youth. I just want to leave 2 or 3 ideas that in this work that we've been really talking about, and that is around looking at adverse childhood experiences and how they impact us as an adult. And that homeless youth typically, there's a variety of reasons why they're homeless. And in some cases, and in many other cases, we know that we're overrepresented by lesbian, gay, transgender youth. We know we're overrepresented by Black and Latino youth that are homeless. But among those groups, we also know that adverse childhood experiences of witnessing violence and witnessing no support in families, in some cases because of who they are, that they've experienced violence, not only neighborhood and community violence, but within the family because of who they are, has an impact on their self. And we are really trying to design these models to have that thinking in hand. The other piece is intergenerational issues, that our kids who've been in homeless shelters, they've been in foster care, and that has been the group of youth who are coming to our shelters. And how do we stop that tide of intergenerational types of homeless? And the other piece that we want in these ingredients in these models is thinking about racism, sexism, and homophobia, all the isms. But particularly when we talk about racism, we don't realize, sometimes we say, oh, well, nobody's, the impact of not being served as well as another, and what that does to you, and how you get stigmatized, really has an impact on how people utilize our services. So we're pushing to design our services so that the youth are involved in that design, and that the promising practices and best practices support what the youth are saying they need. So that's really my whole shtick. And you won't have to hear me anymore.
No. Brevity is the soul of wit. I did appreciate the Can I call you by your first name?
Yes,
please.
Maryanne, I appreciate the ladder versus jungle gym metaphor, and it's arguably an apt metaphor for city government. So obviously the reality of youth homelessness is messy and complex, but the structure of city government is often frustratingly siloed, and those silos can be deeply entrenched. And there was mention of partnership. So how are we breaking down those silos within city government, across agencies, as well as across levels of government with our federal and state partners?
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
How are we grappling with the jungle gym?
Right. Jungle gym and microphone. So great question, and I mean, I want to start by seconding or thirding what both Susan and Maryanne said. You know, I have worked in a lot of administrations, as you've heard, all levels of government, and I have to say, to come into the de Blasio administration 3 months ago and to realize exactly what Susan said, which is that collaboration across agencies is the MO, and it's not just talk, it's actually action, and it's really about coming up with concrete solutions that, you know, that we need to work together to devise and implement. It's really gratifying to feel like part of an administration that works that way. So I think there's a lot going on, and I thought I could actually speak to a few things that we're doing specifically with other city agencies. And I'll start with some of the more sort of focused and then maybe some of the more ambitious ones, and including ending up with CAPS, which Maryanne refers to, which is very exciting in the early stages, but very, very exciting. So we have been working for some years now with NYCHA to make sure that some of our youth who age out of the foster care system have access to NYCHA apartments. It was one of the resources the city is able to provide. It's within our portfolio, and so for those young people for whom that seems like the best available housing option, we have and we will continue to make sure that there are NYCHA units available for them. We have more recently begun a pilot with HUD at the federal level to look at making Section 8 vouchers available for youth aging out of foster care. Again, it's a little bit different resource, obviously. Different kids have different needs in terms of levels of support, in terms of their ability to navigate the housing market on their own. But we think for some kids, a Section 8 may be a resource that will enable them to go out there and find an apartment that is appropriate for them, and they have the skills to handle on their own. So those are a couple. With DHS, one of our concerns has been young people who leave foster care before they have to. They're not 21, but they had a bad experience with a foster family, foster parent, whatever, and leave foster care, and we want to get them back. And sometimes they end up in the homeless system. So we have developed a data match with DHS so that if one of our kids who has been in foster care and is still foster care eligible ends up in the shelter, we get an alert from DHS so that we can reach out to them and try to re-engage them, not just in foster care, if we try to do that, of course, but also in the other services or other benefits that they're eligible for because they're foster care or former foster children. They may be eligible for a bunch of different things that other folks entering the DH system wouldn't necessarily be. And we want to make sure that they know that and they have access to that. So we're working closely with DHS to make sure we identify those young people at the earliest possible moment that they enter shelter, so we can see if we can find other resources available for them. We, again, a more recent initiative, and this is more in the area I talked about around employment and other kinds of services. We have a new, but I think, exciting partnership with HRA to create a new access point for our young people aging out of foster care to access HRA-related benefits and services. HRA has actually been a great partner in developing a particular entry system just for those kids to get not just benefits that they may be available through HRA, but HRA, of course, offers lots of employment, job training, all sorts of ancillary services that could be tremendously beneficial for them. But they may get lost if they enter the way that thousands of other people in New York City enter that system. So we're working with HRA to make sure that they have a sort of a unique entry point and service pathway. And then sort of bigger picture, we are, and most apropos to this conference, of course, supportive housing, we realize, is for some of your young people who need not just housing, but really need that housing embedded in a more supportive environment to help them really function independently. Supportive housing is the optimal solution. We had a set aside of units under New York 3. That's sort of my generation was New York 3. I know it's kind of history now, but we still have 200 beds, kids in those beds, but of course those resources are now really pretty much fully utilized. So with the next iteration, with NYC 1515 or New York 4, whatever we want to call it, we are working very closely with HRA to make sure that we have additional supportive housing units available for our kids, and especially for two populations that were not served through New York 3, pregnant and parenting young people and single adults. And so we will have a significant number, hundreds of units set aside in the 3 RFPs that HRA is working on to allocate those NYC 1515 units specifically for those two groups of young people who have been in our system working with us, but need housing as they transition out. And then finally, the CAPS program, the Coordinated Assessment and Placement System, which again is the early stages, but very exciting. It's what the city is doing to respond to a new HUD mandate that every jurisdiction have a coordinated homelessness entry system, and CAPS will be New York City's. And fundamentally, and I'm not an expert on this, but I'm very excited to be part of the development of it with HRA, is the creation of a vulnerability index, so we can look at different categories of young people in different ways of assessing young people to determine how vulnerable they are to homelessness, and then develop the algorithms to match them to the resources that we have. We will never have as many housing resources as we need, ever, no matter what we do. So it's critical that we allocate the ones that we do have as effectively as we can to young people and other adults who need them most and get the right level of services. And CAPS, once it's fully operational, I think will be a sea change in our ability as a city to do that.
Well, I won't say much because I mentioned our collaboration with DHS in order to get more streamlined access to housing subsidies and supportive housing, and just to recognize CIDI's work in this area. When you did a data project that involved young people in each of our systems, then you got us all to the table talking about it, and when we're all in the room, we can help address each problem. So, Paul's at the table and we're talking about what's the best for young people. So I feel from that approach, like from a data and research perspective, you bring the people who can make the policy, that policy we can control and we can address it. So I really love that we're addressing it from that perspective.
That's great. I think I mentioned what we were doing. I can go on.
You exist to break down the silos. It answers itself.
That's right.
In collaboration with our state and federal partners, I guess I want to evoke our president, Donald Trump, right, and what it means for the city. What impact does the new political climate and fiscal climate in Washington, so much is speculative, but give us a sense of what impact it could have on your ability to tackle this crisis.
Well, we don't know yet.
Yeah.
We're very concerned, and there are, I guess, a few specific things that we have begun to see, which reinforce that concern. So the president's budget that was released just last week, I guess, right, just a week or so ago, has some very worrisome things in it from our perspective, specifically around child welfare funding. And so it's really two things. It's the core funding streams that support our child welfare programs, but it's also the benefits and support services that the families that we deal with in the child welfare context need in order to be self-sufficient in other ways. There are a number of cuts, very substantial cuts proposed by the president around not just things like Medicaid and SNAP, which are critical, obviously, and critical supports to the families, but also to programs like the Social Services Block Grant, a lot of funding from which is used by New York State and most other states to support child welfare programs. And it would be zeroed out completely in the president's budget. And some other things like that. So from a funding perspective, the budget would be very, very problematic for New York City. It would cut the heart out of a lot of the work that we're currently doing and a lot of the initiatives we're talking about here. Second thing I would say is we've heard more than we've seen, but we're even beginning to see, I think, the impact of the change in policies around deportation. And we are very concerned about two things. One is about if more parents are deported under the change in deportation policies, what happens to their children if they're left here. They will be our responsibility. We will take care of them, but that's going to be a burden for the city. And we also are worried and are beginning to see some signs this is happening. People are reluctant to seek services because they're afraid that that will bring them to the attention of authorities and potentially subject them to deportation. So we're hearing a lot of, and we're beginning to see a little bit, for example, of people being afraid to report domestic violence because they don't want to have to engage the systems that actually, between the police, even though New York is a sanctuary city and we do not report, but people are very worried about that and understandably worried about that. So we're very worried about the impact that deportation policies may have on people's willingness to seek services. And then the third thing I would say is, and again, we have seen some of this, but we've heard potentially more disturbing things about shifts in attitudes towards LGBTQ people, especially young people, and welcoming them into services and accessibility and non-discrimination in service delivery. And they are a disproportionate part of our foster care population, as Maryanne said. So anything that either subjects them to discrimination or that they fear may result in that is again going to affect people who are particularly vulnerable and who are a real focal population for the work that we're doing.
I don't have much to add to the budget part because the exciting expansion that I talked about, for example, is virtually entirely funded with city money, but we recognize, of course, our agency, many of the supports that go to young people and also our anti-poverty initiatives are, fully at stake. And the problem is budgeting is prioritization, and we will have, everything will be on the table if we have to respond. So we're mindful of that, even though most of our resources for this particular service are city funded. And I just wanted to float this thing out there, which is nothing more than a completely unvalidated idea in my mind. But I mentioned to my colleagues, I have heard...
That hasn't stopped the president.
Yeah, now I don't even want to talk. I've heard from a handful of providers, including LGBT providers, that things with young people, and I'm curious to know what people think after this panel, things with young people are getting way more volatile, and that they're seeing more quick to snap, more fighting, more need for additional staff in the nighttime and interventions. And we've discussed like whether this, for many of us, we're going to go down fighting, and we have outlets for activism and just peer supports and family supports. But if you don't have that, you really might just feel like punching someone in the face. And so I worry that we've seen an uptick in violence among young people since November, and I'm kind of attuned now to anybody who's giving feedback in that area. That's something we need to look closely at.
Yeah, I think that's really a serious concern, just what has been mentioned, that there's no holds bar anymore, that anything is okay and anything isn't okay, and how we speak with one another and how we act with one another, that our role models have unfortunately been troublesome in that way. And I think that's really important for youth to have good role models, because that's what matters and that's how you aspire to be better than who you are and to be who you are. I also am concerned about, and you know this very well, around the housing policies, that there seems to be a tremendous lack of understanding around housing, whether it's supportive housing, whether it's NYCHA, and how people are able to purchase homes, support homes that are being supported by taxpayers. It's really unwieldy, the robustness of how they want to undo our housing tax credits and our housing strategies in our country for low-income and poor people. So I think that is also really critical, because if you don't have a home, it's really hard to live. And so that piece is, I think you can probably answer that question really well.
Well, I think we're here to celebrate the creation of 35,000 units of supportive housing.
Yeah.
And most of the funding that we receive for affordable housing in general and supportive housing in particular comes from the federal government. We need those resources to sustain that achievement well into the future. Now, we do have a HUD secretary who believes that the housing should not be too comfortable. That's his position. Setting aside Donald Trump, we often speak of the need to end homelessness, to break the cycle. We've heard all these phrases. Setting aside Donald Trump, do we have the tools at the city level to end homelessness?
Taking the mic. I'll say that I believe, we have 120 additional beds coming online, as I mentioned, for RHY within probably the next 6 months. And I am excited to say that at least with under 21, we may be able to address at least shelter and transitional housing to get young people off the street. That's, a small part of a bigger issue.
So I'll add to that, since he's not here, I'll take his name in vain, but our commissioner, our colleague Commissioner Steve Banks is certainly committed to making sure that we have a homelessness system that will end adult homelessness in New York City. And I think they're well on the way to doing that. I would say in addition to the resources, which we have through Susan's system and we have through the homeless system, I think the key element, and I'm going to sing Maryanne's praises on this, the key element is data, because as I said earlier, we can have all the resources, but if we're not using them effectively, people are still going to slip through the cracks. And what we need ultimately to prevent that from happening is a really good understanding of who's homeless, why they're homeless, what it is they need, in addition to housing, to keep them from. We know that housing is not enough for everyone to break the cycle of homelessness, that they need other things as well. They need a more comprehensive package of services. And so getting a better understanding of who is homeless and why they're homeless, and then how we can match them to both housing and available support services, I think is as much key as having the resources.
I'm always the internal optimist, and I think we can end youth homelessness. I really think through the collaborative, we spend, when we looked at the services, we spend a lot of money on this group of people. And I think if we put our heads together and we could think through how, through regulatory issues, that maybe we get some waivers, and we could think through how we spend money for this group and do it differently, that we could end it.
So through data, resources, multi-agency collaboration, we have the power. And
Can I add a pitch at this moment?
of course,
It
it is budget negotiation.
We have youth providers in the room, I'm sure. I know we have housing providers and human service providers. And I want to say, if you haven't been in the game of providing services for runaway and homeless youth, the people who are also here at today's conference who do the work can tell you what a wonderful and rewarding experience that is. And we have an open-ended RFP with money available. We fund at $47,000 per bed annually. And I would love to talk to you more about inviting you to learn more about providing runaway and homeless youth services, so we can get that funding that's been allocated out the door, so that doors are open and young people get into safe, welcoming environments.
Yeah, and I would say the prevention is an issue. The issue around thinking about parents and families, because when we think of the leading factors of why kids leave their homes, a lot of times it's because their parents have had it with them. And often there's good reasons why the parents have had it with them. And when we think about what parents have to say, is that they don't like their friends, they're afraid of their friends, they're afraid of the people they're hanging with, they can't control their kid. And these are very serious issues for a parent when you have a kid you can't control. And we need to do more around those prevention issues, so a kid is not leaving, and that a parent and families are getting those kinds of supports to help an adolescent who's got an environment going on where all the friends have all sorts of things that we don't want them to have. And that is very real in the world of our city. And that is something from a prevention, and ACS does an amazing job in their prevention models to do some of that work, and more of that needs to be brought to bear for this particular group.
So I think I want to open up to the audience unless there are any final thoughts or pitches or, okay. Any questions? Okay, so how should we go about? I'll start.
I just, related to the tools that our city would have to end homelessness, I just wonder if there are cities outside the United States that are getting closer to that objective, that have been looked at, and their tools that they use, or that sort of thing, if you have any thoughts about that, or if you've already, research has been done, or I'm sure that's.
We're always looking outside the city, outside the country, and, you know, in Europe, there's a different economic situation in the sense of the safety nest and that is very different than it is in our country. So sometimes we actually adopted the foyer program from France and England and Ireland, and we evaluated that program. We saw that it works, and that's a program for young people to live together with a common agenda of going to school or working. So we have adopted some of these models from other folks, but we also have to realize our local issues.
Yeah, I'm sort of not an expert on that. I don't have sort of encyclopedic knowledge of it, but a couple things I guess I would say. One is, unfortunately, homelessness is a problem in the United States on a scale that it doesn't exist in other industrialized countries in the world. So we have some unique challenges, I think, when it comes to homelessness. What I do know is that there are other countries, especially European countries, but also some in other parts of Australia and elsewhere, that have, I think, much more well-developed and sort of comprehensive programs for youth employment education services. They're actually in the EU. There's actually a mandate that every country have some kind of a youth employment agency that is supposed to match every young person, I think up to the age of 25, with either education, employment, job training, something, so they're engaged in some activity moving them towards self-sufficiency. And they engage community partners and education organizations, something like that. So there certainly are, in that area, there are some models that I think we could benefit from in the U.S.
Em?
Hi, I was just wondering, you know, when we talk about runaway homeless youth and the disproportionate representation in terms of LGBTQI and stuff like that, and we also know that, and of course people of color, young adults of color, and so we know that that's the epicenter of the HIV epidemic right now, right, in New York City. That's where it's happening, is young men who sleep with men and even lesbians and, you know, all that stuff. So I'm just wondering, as we're talking about creating these new models and ending, what sorts of programming is available to ensure, or that you're thinking about in terms of, you know, just ensuring zero viral load and all those, you know, really, really important things in terms of, I mean, so that's an opportunity for prevention right there. Mm-hmm. So, and not just in terms of taking care of the young adults themselves and helping them take care of themselves.
I'll just say quickly, I love that question, and as we continue to unroll this like new investment in runaway homeless youth beds, I talked to my colleagues like Sam and Randy about how we'd love for that to happen, like where we can really provide a bed for every young person for a number of reasons, but also because it would allow us to turn our attention more to prevention and health supports and education and employment, which we do, but we, like right now, we have a strong emphasis on number of beds, and I feel the need for vulnerable young people who may be like unstably housed, but really they're not looking for a shelter bed. They need these other kinds of supports around their whole being housed. Like, we are excited to, you know, turn more attention to those kinds of supports that young people need. So I really appreciate that question.
Well, and since we don't have HRA at the table, I feel an obligation to channel HRA and, of course, talk about the work that HRA does through the hospice system, the HPA Services Administration at HRA, which does provide housing for and has recently, in this administration, been expanded in terms of eligibility from people with symptomatic HIV infection to a broader population of people with HIV infection, so that people for whom prevention, and as we know, housing is prevention. You cannot focus on protecting yourself from a health perspective if you don't have your basic needs met, including housing. So, it absolutely is a way to engage people around other health-oriented activities and educational initiatives. So the work that Haskell does, I think, is central to the kind of thing you're identifying. And it's not the only place in which that needs to happen in the city or is happening, but that's really the focal point, I think, of the response for people who already are infected or affected by HIV and therefore need the kinds of educational risk reduction or other kinds of viral load reduction activities and medical support that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Asumi. I actually work at a supportive housing program that houses both families that come from the Department of Homeless Services and youth aging out of care. So we have a complex dynamic. Some of the things that I've been observing, I'm fairly new. I usually would send folks to supportive housing. Now on the other end, so it's been interesting to kind of see what the challenges are, in particular with the youth. We're supposed to move these folks out, these young adults that are still children, not quite adults. They've been, we've heard about it the afternoon about what are the challenges that they're facing leading up to now being in supportive housing, but yet being shuffled again. And things that we're not talking about is what you mentioned, Mr. David?
Hansell?
I can't see your last
David,
name.
yeah. Uh-huh.
The wraparound services. Yes, housing is a vital need, but the fact that we're not addressing all the other things that are needed to be able to move forward or be successful with housing and kind of put a gap with that recidivism back into the system is the things that are not being addressed, I feel, from my end. We're focusing on them moving out. You have this voucher, you gotta go, whatever, but what about the fact that you don't know how to keep an apartment clean, or you don't know how to keep a job, or you don't know how to, that you have to clean yourself every day, you have to bathe, like all these different things are not being addressed already from the 20 and down position, but now we're still dealing with it 21 and older. So I struggle a little bit with that, with the fact that now I have to shuffle these young adults not quite ready for society out into the world, why can't they stay where they're at and get the services that they need and be able to become more contributing individuals in society? I just feel like it's just we're on this hamster wheel and it's not quite like, when are we gonna get off? And I don't know if that's really a question, but more of a frustration, because I came here thinking that I was gonna get more information on 21 and over, 18 out of 26. Yeah. But I see that there's so much more work to be done on the other side before they even get to the side that I'm talking about. It feels a little bit, I like the fact that now everybody's coming to the table and having this conversation, so it's a little refreshing, but we got a lot of work to do. Feeling a little overwhelmed.
That's how we ask questions in the city council.
And the way we answer in the city council is, we'll get back to it.
That's what I was afraid of.
No, you're absolutely right. That's a very fair point. And I think those of us who've worked in supportive housing over the years anywhere know that it has always been a tension in supportive housing, right? That it is supposed to be, for most people, temporary. But the reality is you wouldn't qualify for it in the first place if you didn't have some pretty significant needs that keep you from being able to survive on your own. That's why you need supportive housing. And so the challenge of getting people from where they are when they enter it to where they need to be when they leave it is a huge challenge, and you're putting your finger on it. And that's why we've got to come up with, as I was saying, integrated models that aren't just about the housing, but are also about the self-sufficiency supports that enable people ultimately to exit housing.
No, there was a familiar face right behind the previous questioner.
Hi. One of the challenges that we're currently facing with young adults who are transitioning from the DYCD system into the DHS system is that their time spent in DYCD shelters is not being aggregated with the time that they're spending in DHS shelter systems, and they're not qualifying for chronic homeless tags. So we have opportunities to place individuals who qualify by means of Access 1 diagnoses in supportive housing opportunities, but the fact that they're not chronically homeless by HUD standards, based on their shelter stay in DHS shelter systems, we're not able to get them. Is there anything in the spirit of interagency, is there anything that we're doing to address this issue?
Yes,
Yeah.
we have taken steps to address that.
You clearly touched a nerve. Yeah.
We'd like to attest on your form for the time that they spent in the DYCD shelter, and we have contacts at HUD who support and approve that approach. So we'll connect with you, and we know you, so you can connect with Maryanne. We gave a big shout out to Project Renewal earlier, and the great work you're doing. Yeah, we can take care of that.
Okay, great.
Yeah. And thank you for everything you're doing with the LGBT youth shelter. So, this gentleman here.
Yes, just wanted to say a quick question for the commissioner. About
Which
this
one?
Commissioner Hansell,
Okay.
excuse me. About this new launch model with your partnership with CUNY. As I'm thinking, I just wanted to get a clarification about the process. When I think about college, getting to college is one thing, staying in college is another. And when I was thinking about financial aid, I was remembering the image of the jumble with the ladder. And navigating financial aid is often a challenge for foster youth. Is there going to be a technical service that will be offered for the youth that are as enrolled in this program to ensure that they keep getting those financial supports that are so integral to their being maintained in college?
Yeah, well, as I said, the package that we're providing includes tuition, room and board, and incidental money for them. So that goes with the program. In addition, there will be support services, and actually, there is an RFP on the street right now for a partner organization that's working with us in making sure that the kids in this program get those services. So I can't say much about it, except if you're interested, check out the RFP.
And there was a gentleman over there who had his hand up before.
Yes, Commissioner, you spoke of the undergird of education being the greatest equalizer in terms of young adults being successful. And you spoke of the pilot program that we have at ACS, which is really wonderful. But we know we have a lot of young adults who don't have GEDs, and that at 16, for example, they don't want to go to school. What can we do in working with other city agencies in terms of affecting policy to change that for kids in foster care at that lower level? You're not going to get to the level that we're talking about in terms of the college and what we set up for them if they can't even get a GED. Is there anything we can do in terms of changing policy for those in foster care to ensure that education becomes a more considered path for them?
Well, I'm going to say something that I'm actually going to let Julie speak to this because I think she can probably talk in more detail than I can. But yes, absolutely. And we consider it a fundamental responsibility of our foster care agency, when the kids in foster care, to do everything we can to support those kids in ideally getting through high school, getting a high school diploma, but if not, a GED. There's a lot that there are supports that we provide to them in terms of helping transport kids, make sure kids can get to school, since they may not be we try to place them as much as we can in their home neighborhoods, but we can't always do that, so making sure they can get to school, and then providing support for them to stay in school and hopefully graduate. And we monitor and track that very closely, and frankly, as part of the performance of each of our 27 foster care agencies around the city. So this is a high priority for us. But Julie, do you want to speak to that more?
Sure. I mean, like the commissioner said earlier, our greatest focus on prevention, right, is preventing youth from aging out of foster care. And one of the things that we're really proud of at ACS is the vast majority of kids in foster care either go home to their parents or get adopted or end up in kinship guardianship. We actually have about 700 kids that age out a year, so not 1,200.
This includes reunification that end up homeless.
Okay.
Sorry, Julie.
Which is not good. But so it's only quote unquote about 700, but the vast majority of kids who leave foster care are leaving to reunification or adoption. And we also, in the last, I think it's 5 years, there's been a 50% reduction in the number of kids in foster care that end up in a DHS shelter within 1 year. So, those numbers are pointing in the right direction. But, what's really important, obviously the more supportive housing and all sorts of housing slots, that we can have is critical. But as the commissioner said, what's really important is our focus on education and workforce initiatives. So, in addition to the CUNY initiative that the commissioner mentioned that is fully funded and those kids are fully supported, there are a number of initiatives around younger kids in foster care in terms of improving their educational outcomes and looking at the key intervention points. 3rd grade is a key point, and 9th grade is a key point. And we work with our foster care providers around that, and we are actually just about to roll out a new guidebook for foster parents around creating sort of education supportive resources that foster parents can access. And we partner with an entity called FedCap that delivers a program called Prep Now, which is around creating college-going culture in foster homes and all of that. And then on the workforce side, actually, as Susan knows, we have a partnership with DYCD that we really just launched this past year. When you're talking about the 16-year-olds who maybe aren't necessarily going to go to college, DYCD has this young adult internship program, YAIP, that wasn't necessarily working for our kids because of their, sort of special circumstances and needs. And so we had a great partnership, and this is sort of an example, council member, of interagency collaboration, working with DYCD, where we created a YAIP Plus, which is a special program for youth in foster care that is around internship and employment readiness. And so, I think our commitment, at ACS is really around prevention from an education and workforce perspective. And there's a lot underway in that area.
I also have to, I'll just mention this, it's not exactly on point, but it's pretty close, but just because it just happened, like how progressive, and it's very exciting, and that is that we are now helping kids in foster care get driver's licenses.
Yes.
That's very cool.
Yes. Did you see our mind?
Yeah, which, is not only useful as just a life skill, but also can be very useful as a professional
Job.
skill.
Be a UPS driver, and it's a good union job.
Right.
Ma'am?
I have a question. Percentage of the families that are in the family shelter that I work at, they're youth, parents. They're family and they're under the age of 21. And they may have fallen through the cracks somehow and not been able to receive that transitional support services that you mentioned. And often there's a DV situation or a situation where they're unable to handle the relationship and they end up leaving and going to the single side. So I'm really interested in hearing about bypassing that assessment at the single shelter, because some of those individuals are scared to go to single side for various reasons. I mean, they're young and they're under the age of 21, but is that actually in place right now, a streamlining assessment that will at the single side so the youth don't have to stay there? Or what's the alternative to that?
Let's talk about that. We actually just finalized the referral form. We haven't done the first official bypass yet. Well, what you're talking about is from DHS family to DHS single. I think that's an interesting question. I would have to
I think
talk
that
to
Commissioner
DHS.
Banks has been really thinking about, it's almost a misnomer to say single adults. It's really adults, because many of the adults in the homeless shelters are parents. And that is something that at different points there's issues around that and how we deal with the adults. So that's a well-taken point, and I think that when we looked at the numbers, we're certainly including that group of young people in adult shelters and young people in what we call adult family shelters, where there's not a young child, but it's often enough for the young people, it's a partner that they've, and that is an issue that we are, they're, if you will, part of the planning process.
Family planning as well. I mean, we have these young parents with 1 to 2 children. So, I mean, is that in the scheme of transitional services? Is that something that's part of the mental health piece? I mean, what's being done about that in terms of supporting our youth and making sure they understand the choices?
I think that's what this collaboration is hoping to do really is to try to think through, to make sure that wherever a young family, wherever they are, that they're brought to bear some of the services that any young person would need. And whether that's parenting skills or healthy birth, prenatal healthy birth, whatever education, employment, that all of that is brought to bear in the service delivery. And it's complex and complicated because that requires us all to work from the health department perspective, the shelter perspective, the youth perspective. There's, if you will, there's 6 professions coming together to work among the youth with different language, different ways of being, and that is what the collaboration has really been about, and trying to really get what are those essential ingredients we need to be bringing to bear for all youth, no matter where they are.
So it was mentioned that there will be available Section 8 vouchers. Are there any discussions about attaching services to those that could model, let's say, the vouchers where, it's a Section 8 voucher that they can use anywhere, but there are services attached to those?
You know, there was a discussion in one of the groups about thinking about models that we did for, it was called Shelter Plus Care. You'll remember this, David.
Yep.
And Shelter Plus Care, for some of you who remember, is a Section 8 voucher with services. And it provided services. And there was, some of the thinking has been for special needs folks or very vulnerable folks who will never have enough traditional supportive housing, but some of the Shelter Plus Care modeling might be appropriate where it's housing plus services and a wraparound. And I think that's all part of the process of the CAPS and the planning and thinking about that in terms of the in terms of the housing, not just the assessment, but the housing side of life.
I did not mention this, but I should, especially because there may be providers or organizations in the room who would be interested in this. But we are relaunching a program called Supervised Independent Living Programs, or SILPs, which existed in the past.
Yes.
We're bringing them back. And they are small group settings for young people who've aged out of foster care, who aren't quite ready to live on their own, but could be successful in small group settings with, again, sort of some support services provided. We have a concept paper for the SILPs on our website. We're at this point still soliciting input on the model, and then we'll be, based on that, issuing an RFP for these programs. So this is something that you think your organization might be interested in. Please take a look at the concept paper, give us feedback if you have it, and then keep an eye out for the RFP.
Sir? Sharon?
Yes, I have a 2-part question. The first one is, why did the program stop the first time? What you just described?
SILPs.
Before my time.
Yeah, it was many years ago, and I think it was a sort of a choice by a prior commissioner of sort of resources and attention, and we wanted to bring it back because we felt it was an important segue for young people, at the end of their time in foster care to prepare them for independent living. So we're excited to bring it back.
Was there a quantifiable reason for, other than the commissioner, was there a quantifiable reason, like it was so successful we didn't need it? Or it was clearly we didn't need it?
No, I think it's more a philosophical issue.
Yeah,
it's a philosophical issue, and it was during the time of the recession that it was cut. So there was some tensions, if you will, with all city agencies having to cut programs. That program was cut in part because of the philosophical tension that all children were viewed as needing a family, and SILPs were not getting us where children were needing a family. But in fact, that's just another piece where, when we're talking about adolescents and young people, that I think there are different models, and we don't have to be locked in to that. We would love it, ideally, if every young person had a family and a resource family. And I think we all want that for all our young people. And at the same time, the SILP model didn't support that ideology at the time, and there was no money for it, so it was cut.
second part to my question is, and it sounds like there's a lot of sampling, a lot of quantitative math going into what I'm hearing up front. So is there a quantitative understanding of how long would it take to end homelessness amongst teenagers if we used these tools? Is it going to take us another 100 years? Is it going to
Hey, I
take us
love your
another-
idea. We have not done that, so that's a great
Yeah, all these
idea.
models. I'm sure we have some understanding of what that looks like. Do we?
We actually have not modeled out what it would, how long it would take us to resolve the issue. We haven't modeled that out. What we've been modeling out is looking at youth at the different agencies and what's happening among youth in the different agencies. And that's what we've been really, that was our first step.
And then fleshing out the details behind that
Yeah.
question. Are you talking about youth under 18 or youth under 21, youth under 24? Are youth, can we say we've ended it if they're in a shelter, or do we need to have them in a more permanent? So I feel like there's a lot of layers to that that would need to be, that would have different timelines.
What would you define as a solution to homelessness, to ending?
Well, like I said, the thing that I'm most focused on at DYCD, that we're most focused on, is bringing on additional beds so that we can say, in terms of street homelessness for young people under 21, that you have an option in a youth-friendly, supportive environment, that call us up, we have a bed available. That's one landmark in a much bigger picture that I'm excited about. And, we're going to be facing this challenge as a city to decide about a youth focus for young people older. The age keeps going up for young people, and we want to make sure that young people even older have a youth focus. So I'm focused right now, probably for the next year and a half, 2 years, on this under 21 street homelessness thing. But then, of course, we're simultaneously addressing what's the next step after your shelter. Are you going to get into supportive housing? Are we making a pathway for you, even though you've never been in foster care or spent a long time in the adult system? Yes, that's one of our goals. Can we get you access to housing subsidies and support to be successful with those subsidies from a DYCD shelter, which has never happened before? You've always had to be in an adult shelter system. So focus on the shelter right now for us, our perspective, focus on the under 21, but also like the next steps, longer term support for those young people.
Yeah.
I heard multiple times people mentioning using the data that we have and analyzing that first. And I'm also really pleased to hear a lot of interagency collaboration, both in sharing information, sharing data, and coming up with solutions. But my question is more about kind of next steps in terms of data's flawed, data's always incomplete, imperfect. In terms of identifying data that you need, what are certain gaps that you all have identified? And then going beyond that, how are you working together as different government entities, but also is there any work being done to work with service providers or other outside stakeholders in this mission to address youth homelessness? Because there's a lot to be said in terms of getting the perspective of people who are actually using what the tools that you're giving and kind of working in policy and practice and sort of learning from what they're seeing, and then also further refining the information you have and also the policies that you're implementing. So
Let me say one of the beautiful things about youth homeless right now in the state of where it is, this work has been under the continuum of care. The continuum of care in New York City is a HUD-funded entity, if you will, that distributes about $100 million for supportive housing and for services for homeless people. Under that rubric, they have a youth committee. And I've got to say, there are clients, residents, youth. It is what I call direct democracy. Our meetings are with providers, researchers, the youth themselves, ourselves, and how we've worked it is that we have a steering committee that we put on conferences with youth to get them to help us to map out what is going on and how we should respond and how we should design our response to meet their needs. Out of that, DYCD, ACS, and HRA and DSS have really responded, and these issues, I'm not saying they're resolved, by no means, but that they've emerged as issues, and we're continuing this process as we speak. And we will have some further coordination to help that process along. But it is one of the more beautiful processes that's going on in the city, and I really believe it's because of the direct democracy of the continuum of care. As much as I complain about it, it does have voices of a variety of perspectives in that way.
We'd love to know more about what happens to young people, runaway and homeless youth, like when they leave. Let's say, for example, our transitional independent living, and we have an evaluation underway right now, which is going to get us some good data, but that will be just like scratching the surface. CIDI's report got us a little information about how many of them return. So what happens after is really interesting, and we need to know a lot more about that.
You know, I didn't go over the whole report. I didn't even begin the report. The staff put together some slides. But let me just say that something like 60% come back within 2 years, which is not so, you know, what was it? Flip, 60% come back. 30,
40, it's getting better every second.
60 to 70 don't come back.
60 to 70 do not come back, and 30 and 40 do come back. So we know of that 30% who come back that there's something going on, whether it's a situation where they were referred or spent didn't work out and they're coming back. On one hand, we think of coming back in two ways. It's not a great outcome. At the same time, they came back. And that is good that they're coming back and they're getting the services, because they're still adolescents and they're still young people. So we're looking at that from each of the agencies. You can look at our report. I can show you a little bit of that on the next slide that will show you from each agency what percentage came back. But what we'll do next is to look among all of the youth to see if there are characteristics of youth who come back more than others, so that we can help identify them in the agencies and provide services and help the agencies to understand the risk levels of certain youth. We know in foster care that if a youth has multiple movements in foster care, they're likely to have poorer outcomes. So there are things within our systems that we know that we're bringing to bear in the data.
The other thing I wanted to add, I would never try to trump Maryanne on data issues.
No, please do.
The other thing I want to observe is, you're absolutely right, you know, data are basically just, you know, zeros and ones, right? It's nothing unless you actually figure out how to use it to inform good decision making. And one of the things that New York City has done, and this is another thing, it's wonderful to come back to the city after being away for 10 years and see what's happened with, is to create an infrastructure for bringing data together across many city agencies to be able to really develop a more holistic picture of the individuals and families that we're working with and the kind of service systems we have. The HHS Connect system that is about 10 years old now was, I think, a really foresighted initiative to do exactly that. And as I say, it's wonderful to come back now and see how far it's come since I left, and all the ways in which we at ACS are tapping into the data of all of our brother and sister city agencies around the country, so we can understand what's happening with the families that we're dealing with and where there may be other resources available for them outside of our service system.
Can I ask a quick question about that? How reliable and complete is our data about the extent of youth homelessness? Because I've heard, like, specifically,
$1 million
well, specifically with regard to LGBT youth, I've heard numbers well into the thousands.
I think that's, the challenge to that
Yeah.
question is that you need to come to it from a number of different ways. Like, one data set is not gonna answer the question. So, what do I mean by that? Like, defining homeless youth in terms of the age is really important. Like, if the higher you keep going in the age, the more significantly that number tends to grow, because the older you get, the more, potential you have to be homeless. We see LGBT advocates will say approximately 40% of homeless youth, and we see that mirrored in the young people who come to get help with us. And we have drop-in centers too, where you're not necessarily getting housing service, where you're getting services, and we see that evidence that number holds true, that about 40% of homeless youth are LGBT. We have data on what our street outreach providers see on the street and how many of those young people accept transport to shelter. We have data from Homestat going around to see who's on the streets. We have data from the youth count that DYCD does in partnership with CIDI, which counts, again, street homelessness by HUD definition, but we also take that opportunity to learn about unstably housed. So it really gets down to, you could define it a lot of different ways to know a different number. So we need to have all that data in one picture so you can get like the full picture of the situation. And I think we're kind of coming to that point where we keep adding data points to our...
I know CIDI's on it. Ma'am, you had your hand up?
Yes, I have more of an observation. I keep on the comment of homelessness ending with children, and there's so many different factors. I used to work with children, community residents, and I've worked with other providers in that connection, like ACS. And so what I've observed is, number one, a lot of these kids, they have issues of abandonment, they have issues of trust, and if they're being kicked out of a home, or if they have been to many, foster homes, then sometimes they'd rather be out on the street on their own. So, and then when they go into formal settings, such as community residence or shelters, they get mistreated sometimes, and I hear the talk of the buildings, we're building more buildings, but then people are not properly trained on how to deal with these issues and these children, and they feel more safer on the streets. So, the cycle is such a vicious cycle that keeps this going as far as being homeless at such an early age. I just wish that there was something being done from the lower level first to ensure that these care providers, us, really have a passion for what we do, instead of just going in and treating these children like as if they're still on the street. And then maybe they would have more of a sense of trust when they go into a shelter, and it would give them an incentive to get the help that they need to progress into adults.
That's a great point, and actually there is a good deal of work being done there. I would say one of the really fundamental changes in child welfare practice, really in the last decade in this country, has been the move towards what we typically talk about as trauma-informed models of services. There's been it used to be in child welfare that we thought if a kid had to be removed from their home, the goal was just get them back into a new home, into a permanent environment, and that would solve the problem. And we've learned that it doesn't, because kids who have experienced some kind of trauma in their lives that led to their being removed from the home in the first place carry that trauma with them wherever they end up. And so we at ACS are moving towards trauma-informed care models in virtually everything that we do, including our foster care program. So we have, over the last several years, under a waiver we got from the federal government, we're now investing a lot of our federal funds into training and supporting our foster care agencies to work with children from exactly the perspective you're describing, which is to understand what they've been through, the trauma that they have experienced, and how to help them deal with that in a way that will enable them to handle stressful situations better in the future. It's absolutely critical, and that's a very important observation.
It is 3 o'clock. I want to thank our panelists for their insight and passion, and let's give them a round of applause.